Hello and welcome back to Jay Hutch Talks Too Much. I'm just realizing now exactly what my hair is doing. So let me just do a quick little fix of that. Hey, how's it going? My name's Jesse. I am your host of Jay Hutch Talks Too Much. Tonight, I think we're going to do a little what I sort of planned to be a smaller episode, maybe a shorter episode, but once I do start talking, it's quite possible it'll end up being our most epic episode of all time. But I'm planning on it being a little bit shorter. Work stuff has become much busier, so we're getting towards the end of my school term. So a lot of work is coming in there. So I thought I would just put together a kind of a fun discussion tonight, rather than a kind of long form analysis that I normally do, where I talk about 10 movies that I think would be, while they are on my favorite movie list that I have been compiling over the last couple of years. That list is now up to 245 movies, and you'll see that list a little bit later on. And a lot of the movies on that list are kind of movies that you would expect to be on a favorite movies list if you are kind of a fan of film, and if you're a cinephile, if I may be so bold and use that term. I don't want to accuse anybody out there of being a cinephile, but I know that there are some, and we're going to find you. But nevertheless, I do have a lot of those conventional sort of movies on the list, but I do have movies as well on the list that are. I'm not going to say that they're, as I say in sort of the description somewhere down there, that that they are obscure movies. I don't think some of them might be a little bit obscure, but for the most part, I would say that they're not obscure. They're also not movies considered to be bad, I don't think. But as if you've watched a few of my videos, I have a kind of an obsession with lists. I like making lists, and I like looking at lists. I like looking at other people's lists. And the following movies that I'm going to talk about are 10 movies that I typically don't see on great movie lists, whether it's that kind of conventional sort of American Film Institute list, that the one that almost always invariably the top five are going to be Casablanca, Citizen Kane, The Godfather, Gone with the Wind, and Some Like It Hot, or something like that. Like those would be your kind of conventional, some kind of permutation of that, or maybe a more serious, like Sight and Sound poll or something like that, which would contain more foreign cinema, or sort of non-English language cinema, which there's a lot of examples of that on my list. There's not as many tonight. There's a few of those, a couple, but not too many of them. Nevertheless, yeah. So they're not movies that are typically on that list either. I don't think I've seen any of them on that. Also, like Roger Ebert's great movie list, which is something like 350 movies or something like that. They're not on that list either. So yeah, so they're not on these 10 are not typically found on those lists. But they're movies that I really like a lot, and would be on my favorite movie list. So in order to really get into them, I am going to share with you the list that I have up as a private list on Letterboxd, so you'll be able to get some insight into that list here. I've shown it before, but you'll probably be seeing more of it tonight. And I think I'm going to go through the list in chronological order. I'm not going to talk about them in great length. I'll kind of just go over them sort of as quickly as I can possibly go over them. And then hopefully, my hope is that someday I will be able to do a kind of longer form video on all of these movies. But the first one, and here I'm going to bring this up. So here's the list. The first one is actually a movie that I have done a long form video of. It's the only one in my list that I have done a long form video of, and it's this "I Am a Fugitive" from a chain gang. So it's a 1932 film directed by Mervyn LeRoy. It stars Paul Muni, and it's basically about this guy, as the description here says. World War I veterans' dreams of becoming a master architect evaporate in the cold light of economic realities. Things get worse when he's falsely convicted of a crime and sent to work on a chain gang. So again, I have a video on this. You can go through my list and find the video I did on "I'm a Fugitive from a Chain Gang." It's actually, I think, one of the most popular videos that I have. I think largely because a lot of people click on it thinking that they're going to see the movie "I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang" and then get bitterly disappointed to find that it's mostly just me talking about it for an hour and a half. But hey, whatever gets the puck in the net, you know what I'm saying? So this movie is again one of many movies, I think, from the 1930s, and I talked about this in the video, that was really addressed really addressed the issue of sort of social ills and the kind of poverty that was rampant as a result of the Great Depression. And a lot of these movies, I said, made a very strong social critique in a way that you didn't find. I'm not saying you didn't find them at all, but you didn't find as many movies doing that in sort of the post 2008 financial crisis era. But this movie really does kind of demonstrate in a dramatic way the story of a guy who has come back again from World War I. He's supposed to be a national hero to some degree, and he just becomes lost, right? He is the sort of forgotten man that you see in several other 1930s movies. And I think, anyways, it's a really well done film. The drama to me never seems to be cliched or hackneyed. There's a lot of sort of excellent sort of iconography throughout it. The way it depicts the experience of living on a chain gang is wonderfully filmed. It's just a great sort of filmic moment, but it's also the extraordinarily compelling drama, I think. And again, one of the early movies that has sound. Obviously, sound gets introduced in the late 1920s, so this is a few years after that. But it does seem to me, at least, to be, very much ahead of its time in terms of the way that it looks and the way that it feels. So it's I think a movie that's well worth checking out. I am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang. I'm gonna skip ahead now to something a little bit lighter and go into the 40s. And I'm gonna pick this one. Is kind of an obscure one, and it's a Bob Hope comedy from 1947 called "Where There's Life." Now, where I have the actual DVD of it is right here. There's actually quite a few Bob Hope movies on my list. Bob Hope is, I will say, somebody who has sort of not fared well as time has gone on, not for the same reasons that other people have not fared well as time has gone on, but mostly because I think this was true of my parents' generation, that I think they found Bob Hope to be this kind of cheesy relic of the past, just really unhip for your 1960s and 1970s audience. And the reason why is because at that time Bob Hope was still around. Bob Hope was still around when I was a kid growing up in the 80s. You would see him in these awful TV specials. If you have the opportunity to look for Bob Hope as dressed up as Jack Frost on one of his comedy specials. I think it's either in the late 80s or maybe even the early 90s. It actually ranks up there with one of the funniest things Bob Hope ever did. Unfortunately, the least intentionally funny thing that Bob Hope ever did, the Jack Frost, the Jack Frost sketch on his show. Again, I highly recommend it. But in the 60s and 70s, Bob Hope would be this guy who would host the Oscars and do walk-ons for talk shows, and just make sort of unbelievably sort of corny jokes. And hey, how you doing? And it'd be very, very kind of lame humor. And you would do those sort of USO tours, and you would see him up there with the golf club. And so you can see why a lot of people would kind of have the impression that Bob Hope was this sort of lame relic of the past, of an earlier time when, let's say, things were less funny. But as you will know from things that I have talked about on Jay Hutch Talks Too Much before, I do like a lot of old comedy. I had my cousin Daniel on the other week talking about Duck Soup, which is a early 1930s comedy, which I think is hilarious. But I also have on my list a lot of Bob Hope movies. Where There's Life is not the only Bob Hope movie, but I think, when push comes to shove, I might call it my favorite Bob Hope movie. And as you can see here, I've given it the full 5 stars. That's the full Monty right there. No, wait, that is not the full Monty. Full Monty is something else. But I give it the full 5 stars. And I do have it on DVD. It's paired up with a movie called Monsieur Beaucaire, which I do think that I don't think any Bob Hope movies would make a greatest movie list, anybody's greatest movie list, I don't think. But I do think that if one were to make it, it would either be the road movies that he does with Bing Crosby, which are fine, but again, to me, not where you'll find Bob Hope's best work. Bob Hope's best work is in my opinion, in my own humble opinion, starring vehicles for him, where he plays this kind of spineless, cowardly figure who's often portraying himself as somebody with a great deal of courage and a great romantic. But when push comes to shove, he's spineless and is not crafty enough usually to do well in a relationship, and is in many ways, I think, a kind of good precursor to the sort of Woody Allen movies that are made in the early 1970s, like Bananas and Play It Again, Sam, and movies like that. You'll see a lot of these early Bob Hope movies in those, and you'll also see a lot of Bob Hope, this character from a movie like Where There's Life. You'll see a lot of this character in Conan O'Brien, in the way that Conan O'Brien would construct his own late night persona, is very much indebted to this Bob Hope character that you're seeing here. So it does seem to me that if you were the kind of person who did find something like Conan O'Brien really funny, that I would think on some level, at least, that you would find Bob Hope's movies funny as well. And again, Monsieur Beaucaire is often the one that's named as the best Bob Hope movie that he's just the sole star of. And I would agree. Monsieur Beaucaire is one of the great Bob Hope movies too. It's also on my list. But I do think that Where There's Life, which is one that I don't think I've ever heard anybody ever talk about, quite honestly, I think is his funniest movie. And if I'm hesitant to read the actual synopsis, because the synopsis doesn't matter so much. Just like when I was talking about Duck Soup last week with Daniel, just like in those kind of sort of early Woody Allen movies like Bananas, the story just becomes something for the character to just make a lot of funny quips, just to see the character's always the same no matter what situation they have been placed in. So the The synopsis here is: in a far off country, their king is critically wounded after an assassination attempt, and the only heir is a timid New York radio personality played by Bob Hope. After reluctantly traveling to his father's homeland, Michael is not happy. That's the Bob Hope character. Michael is not happy that he's become the target of the same terrorist organization that attacked the king. So right away, that to me kind of sounds like it has that sort of bananas feel to it. So yeah, so that is where there's life by Bob Hope. So that's my second choice. Now I'm gonna go back a little bit and just a few steps above that to this movie here called The Stranger. Um, so The Stranger is an Orson Welles movie. Now, Orson Welles, of course, is one of the most beloved filmmakers of all time. Of course, made the movie that a lot of people will say is the greatest film of all time, which is Citizen Kane. And here I'm just going to take a quick little drink of tea. And I would agree with that. Citizen Kane is for me, in my opinion, his best movie as well. I do like almost all of Orson Welles' movies. This one I do like a lot, and it's often one that's not particularly highly regarded. If people will name a great Orson Welles movie that's not Citizen Kane, their usual go-to is either going to be Touch of Evil or The Magnificent Ambersons or The Lady from Shanghai or maybe Chimes at Midnight. But almost never is it The Stranger. And one of the reasons, I think, is because The Stranger was Orson Welles, was a compromise movie for Orson Welles. Orson Welles, throughout his entire life, throughout his entire professional life, always was always under a great deal of pressure from the studio system, who really did not have any faith in him as a filmmaker, which is really ludicrous to me when you think about it, because once again made Citizen Kane one of the all-time towering achievements of cinema. So, in a movie like, for example, The Magnificent Ambersons, the studio recuts it, adds on another ending that I don't think he necessarily approved of. With The Stranger, I think, which comes out a few years after that, from what I can recall, he's under just constant attention from the studios, who are, really constraining him in terms of what he can do. So I think that a lot of people look at The Stranger and see that it's not really an authentic Orson Welles movie. And that might be true, but in my opinion, it's still a great movie. It's still a really entertaining and engaging film. Again, very brief synopsis given here by Letterboxd. A man working for the War Crimes Commission suspects that an important Nazi official has folded himself into a quaint Connecticut town. The person that's Edward G. Robinson, who suspects that Orson Welles is the Nazi who has folded himself into this town. And I think, again, it's just an extraordinarily entertaining movie from beginning to end. And I also think there are a lot of classic, sort of experimental, wonky Orson Welles shots, just in terms of the way that he frames the scene. I think it's a really exciting movie just to look at visually. In the same way that Citizen Kane is, in the same way that The Magnificent Ambersons is, and in the same way that a lot of The Lady from Shanghai is. Just a really kind of exciting movie to look at, and maybe one of the most entertaining stories that Orson Welles told as a filmmaker. So I do really love this one. As I say, it's often not considered to be one of Welles's best, but it is one that I have always liked a lot. And I wanted to leave this to the third one because my fourth choice is sort of similar in that respect, and that is this movie here called I Live in Fear, which is a movie by Akira Kurosawa. Kurosawa is probably in my top three favorite filmmakers. Made some of my most favorite movies ever. I wouldn't say that I Live in Fear is right up there at the top with my most favorite Kurosawa films, which would be Ikiru, um, Throne of Blood, Rashomon, High and Low, um, um, and movies like that. But so I would put movies like that ahead of I Live in Fear. But I still think I Live in Fear is a phenomenal movie, and it's made right in his kind of that golden era. This movie comes in between Seven Samurai, which is another master work, and Throne of Blood, which is his adaptation of Macbeth. So it comes right in between, well, sort of right in between those movies. There might be another movie in between them, but I Live in Fear comes right in that great Kurosawa period, and it's one that's very rarely talked about. It's very rarely positioned as a great Kurosawa film. And if you look at lists of, people ranking Akira Kurosawa movies, I Live in Fear comes pretty, it's not right at the bottom, because usually the ones at the bottom are his sort of pre-Rashomon or pre-Stray Dog movies, I guess. But it comes pretty close to the bottom of those lists, I would say, and I think it's a fantastic movie, and I think maybe it's because the story is so specific. Kurosawa was, of course, a master when it came to telling really big, grand stories that would be told on a large scale. But I Live in Fear is a very small story specifically about a man who is constantly just is suffering from a tremendous amount of anxiety because he's worried that there's going to be a nuclear war at any moment, and he wants to. Of course, remember how significant this is. This is coming. This movie is released 10 years after the nuclear bombs are dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and so in many ways, a lot of Kurosawa's movies are sort of subtle reactions to that, like Stray Dog, for example, is such an anxiety-ridden movie, really about a detective who loses his gun. But again, I think in some ways that when Kurosawa is dealing, he's not just dealing with the anxiety of this man, he's dealing with the anxiety of an entire generation of people who are living in the aftermath of this atrocity that occurred on their land. And so but this movie is unsubtle in its discussion of that topic, and the man is desperate to leave Japan, and he wants to move to Brazil. And as it says here in the description, his family decides to have him ruled incompetent, and Dr. Harada, a domestic court counselor, attempts to arbitrate. I don't really know if that information is all that necessary in the description, but it's again a very gut-wrenching movie. It's not gut-wrenching, I don't think, in the sense that it's hard to watch. Really, at least it wasn't for me. There are some movies that just leave me with a bit of a sick feeling, and this one didn't. But I can certainly sympathize with the anxiety that this man is experiencing, and maybe, for reasons I won't get into right now, but maybe this movie is more relevant than ever. And I think that, again, Kurosawa is tackling it pretty delicately. I don't want to say subtly, but delicately, because you certainly also feel for this man's children who don't want to leave and who are very concerned about the well-being, the mental well-being of their father. Um, so it's a multifaceted story. It's complicated. It's complex. It's dealing with I think a very specific topic that would have been very significant during Kurosawa's time, but still strikes me as being very relevant today. And although I Live in Fear is a frequently overlooked Kurosawa movie, I do consider it to be up there with if it's not his best, but it's among his best movies, I would say. So certainly well worth checking out. Okay, so the next movie that I am going to talk about is from the '60s, and it's a movie called it's a British movie called The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner, which is a movie that's directed by Tony Richardson. Tony Richardson was part of the sort of English New Wave movement. So again, for those of you who are unfamiliar with this term, really that term "new wave" is kind of more associated with the French New Wave, which I'll talk about in just a moment. But you have the French New Wave movement, which is overturning French cinema to a significant degree, altering the kind of movies that France is making. And the same movement is going on in England at the time, in the late 50s, early 1960s. Tony Richardson is one of the major filmmakers of that movement. A big aspect of the British New Wave is what was called kitchen sink realism. And kitchen sink realism was concerned with obviously portraying the actual real lives of ordinary people living in England without the kind of gloss that had appeared in the movies before that. There was no artificial drama. The characters were not types; they were real people, often working class people. And this is a movie actually that I watched in university. I took a class on sort of British film and history. And this was one of the movies that was shown, and it was the one that I loved the most of all the movies that were shown. And this really is, although in some cases, and I wouldn't necessarily say that all the movies that I am, well, in fact, very few of the movies that I'm naming would end up in my absolute top tier of films. So I wouldn't say that I'm a fugitive from a chain gang where there's danger or I Live in Fear would end up in my absolute top movies, although they do end up in my top 245. This one would. The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner, I think, is a really wonderfully made movie. All the emotions in it to me strike me as being very well earned. It's hyper well, it's artistic and it's creative, but also realistic. Just to read again the synopsis: a rebellious youth sentenced to a reformatory for robbing a bakery rises through the ranks of the institution through his prowess as a long distance runner. During his solitary runs, reveries of his life and times before his incarceration lead him to reevaluate his privileged status as a prized athlete. And the guy who plays the main character, who's Tom Courtenay, is fantastic, absolutely fantastic in the film. The acting is great, the story is great, the way it's told is great, how it resolves itself is fantastic. The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner, which again I never see talked about really at all. And I think the last I checked, it's hardly available. There was a version of it. I watched it last year on YouTube, which is actually a pretty good version. The version I found, at least, was pretty good. So if it is still available on YouTube, I do highly recommend you check it out, because it's for me one of the great movies ever made, and again, very, very much overlooked. Okay, so that's The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner. The next movie that I'm going to talk about again is an example of the new wave. I'm a big fan of French new wave cinema, particularly the early Jean-Luc Godard films and the early Francois Truffaut films. This one comes from more of this, not quite the early period of French New Wave, but that sort of mid 60s era when things were shaking up a little bit more. Movies like Masculine Feminine by Godard and Pierrot Le Fou by Godard, movies like that. And this one is a movie by Jacques Rivette, who, again, not really considered in quite the same way as a Godard or a Truffaut or a René, is not typically remembered for that. One of the reasons, perhaps, is that he may have been in some ways even more experimental than those filmmakers. So after he makes this movie, The Nun, which I'm going to talk about here in a second, he makes a movie called Out One, I think it's called. And Out One is, I think, a 13-hour long movie. And I will tell you, I have not seen this movie. I don't know when I will be able to see this movie. That's pretty much my entire waking day right there. So I am, that suggests that I sleep for 11 hours. So that's not entirely true, but close. I do enjoy a good rest. But it's still, you have to put some time aside to watch that. And he was still making relevant movies into the 90s as well. But The Nun is one, I think, is the only Rivette film that I have seen. So I do want to see more, probably the shorter ones. But although, Out One is a goal. That's a goal in a way that, Sallow is not a goal. But Out One is a goal for me to see someday. But The Nun, I thought, was great. It strikes me that, the French New Wave doesn't happen in the same way without the French existentialist philosophical movement that emerges in the sort of post-World War II era. People like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus and Simone de Beauvoir and people like that. That movement, which is, you have books like The Outsider by Camus, to me really kind of sets the tone that the French New Wave artists end up picking up on. And in some ways, I think they kind of come out of the same intellectual culture. Now, it also strikes me that French existentialist movement would not have appeared quite the same way were it not for the Russian literature movement of the mid to late 19th century, people like Dostoevsky and people like Tolstoy. And it seems to me that The Nun is the closest that I've seen to a really good filmic representation of the kind of story that those Russian authors would have written. It's not, as far as I understand, maybe it's an adaptation, but it's not an adaptation of a Dostoevsky novel or a Tolstoy novel or anything like that. It's not that. But it certainly, the story could have been one that one of those guys might have told. And the execution of it, the way it looks, the way that this movie looks is kind of how, in some ways, I imagine a Russian novel looks in my head when I'm reading one. It's a little bit different from a Russian literature novel because it takes maybe a bit of a harder stance on religion than, let's say, a Dostoevsky novel might. Although maybe not so much a Tolstoy story. But again, a very kind of interesting. This movie came under a great deal of censorship in the mid 1960s. In the 18th century, in 18th century France, this is what I'm reading the synopsis. A girl is forced against her will to take vows as a nun. Three mothers superior treat her in radically different ways, ranging from maternal concern to sadistic persecution to lesbian desire. So that is The Nun. Again, a very extremely fascinating movie that is really kind of, again, wonderful to watch all the way through. So that's The Nun. That's 1966, I think, 65, 66, 66. I'm gonna jump ahead here significantly to the 90s. So we're gonna skip all throughout the 70s. We're gonna skip through the 80s, which we all wanted to do, I think, at the time. And we're gonna go right. There's a nice little ad for you. We're going to go right to 1998 with the movie Pleasantville, which many of you will probably remember this movie. This is, again, a movie that somebody left this in the basement of my apartment, and I managed to pick it up. Although I do think I had this on DVD at another point in my life and lost somewhere along the way, but I have it back now. I hope it's actually in good shape. I'm not entirely sure if this DVD is in. It looks all right. So so Pleasantville. Well, if you had asked me in 1998 what my favorite movie was, period, I would have said Pleasantville. Is it still my favorite movie? No. Is it in my absolute top tier movies? No. But do I still think that it's a great movie? Yeah, it's still on my great movie list, my list of 245. Again, if you haven't seen it, I'll read a synopsis of it. Geeky teenager David and his popular twin sister Jennifer get sucked into the black and white world of a 1950s TV sitcom called Pleasantville and find a world where everything is peachy keen all the time. Who wrote this? But when Jennifer's modern attitude disrupts Pleasantville's peaceful but boring routine, she literally brings color into its life. This movie, from what I can remember, sort of came out. The timing of it wasn't great because it came out the same year as The Truman Show, and The Truman Show was, in a lot of people's minds, a much bigger deal. I think largely because of the Jim Carrey performance. And The Truman Show is a fine movie, I think, but I always thought and still think that Pleasantville is a better movie. I think that it's doing something a lot more creatively interesting. I think it's a more interesting movie to look at. But I also think that what it's saying is more interesting than what The Truman Show is saying as well. And I think it's making a larger claim about, what it means to actually be an independent, critical thinker. And I think that's that it's doing so it's in a way that's maybe more nuanced than I think a lot of people gave it credit for at the time. I do remember, just to reference the picture that I put up for this video, that Siskel and Ebert loved this movie at the time. I remember they were like its biggest champions, and I was always kind of happy about that because I love the movie so much. But if you look at Roger Ebert's great movies list, this didn't make the cut. So obviously he didn't like it so much that it would make that list. But it does make my list because I do think it's a really great movie from the late 90s. The next movie I was gonna actually pick. Well, no, okay, I'll talk about this one first. Cradle Will Rock. So Cradle Will Rock is a movie that is directed by Tim Robbins. Tim Robbins, you probably know him better as an actor from The Shawshank Redemption, but Tim Robbins also directed a few movies in the 90s. He directed a movie called Bob Roberts, and he directed a movie called Dead Man Walking with Sean Penn about the death penalty, and Sean Penn and Susan Sarandon. And this was the third movie that he directed, called Cradle Will Rock, which to me is his best movie. And I think it ended up being his last, certainly his last maybe non-documentary film, because I don't think it did particularly well. And it is a movie that's sort of set in that 1930s time that I was talking about earlier, when I was talking about I'm a Fugitive from a Chain Gang. And I was talking about how the art in that era was in some ways more attuned to the concerns of common people. And this movie is very much about that. It's about these people who are trying to put on a musical in the theater district in the States. But because it's representing the wants and desires of the common person, it comes under a lot of pressure, and they try to stop it. And it's kind of about that sort of political world of the 1930s. But it's not just a political movie. It's also just a very entertaining movie. It's kind of, in some ways, to me, a little bit like a Robert Altman movie. A lot of movies from that time were picking up on that sort of Altman-esque way of telling a story, with a lot of characters, and a story that kind of weaves in and out of those characters' lives, and sometimes they mix together. So, for example, that same year that Cradle Will Rock came out, Paul Thomas Anderson made Magnolia, which is, very stylistically similar to Cradle Will Rock, actually, but about a much different topic. And again, I do like Magnolia, and I like Paul Thomas Anderson, but I do prefer Cradle Will Rock. As I say, it's got that sort of it has that big cast. Actually, let's look at the cast here, as it's listed here. Hank Azaria from The Simpsons fame, John Cusack. He got both Cusacks for this film. Now that's a coup. So consider that. How many movies have both Cusacks in it? Carrie Elways playing John Houseman, Philip Baker Hall, Cherry Jones, Bill Murray, Vanessa Redgrave, Susan Sarandon, John Turturro, Emily Watson, Bob Balaban. Tenacious D is in this movie. Jack Black and Kyle Gass. Paul Giamatti is kind of an amusing character in the movie as well. Orson Welles and John Houseman, who again were theater buddies. Both are characters in this. I can't remember. I'm trying to remember who plays. Oh, it's Angus McFadden who plays Orson Welles. It does a pretty good job of it, I would say. So yeah, Cradle Will Rock is a really phenomenal late 90s movie. Again, it's on Disney Plus, or at least it was the last time I checked. So definitely well worth checking out if you're able to see it. The next movie that I was going to choose was going to be You Can Count on Me. But I just so happened this morning to find out that Paul Thomas Anderson had made a list in recent years of his favorite movies, and You Can Count on Me was on it, which shocked me, to be honest with you. I'm glad that it did, because I think it is a great movie from the beginning of the 21st century. So that would have been that up until early this morning. You Can Count on Me was going to be a movie that I talked about tonight, and I'm talking about it now. But I'm going to skip over it and talk about this movie instead, which is Wonder Boys, which is a movie directed by Curtis Hanson. Curtis Hanson, this is his follow-up to another great movie that he made in the 90s called LA Confidential, which was his take on the noir. Such a great sort of stylistic movie from the late 90s. But Wonder Boys is his follow-up. And I have to say, again, I think that I like Wonder Boys more than LA Confidential. As much as I like LA Confidential, I think that I would say that I like Wonder Boys even more. Wonder Boys is this is one of two Tobey Maguire movies in my list tonight, but it stars Michael Douglas. Here to read I'll read the synopsis. He's a 50-ish English professor who hasn't had a thing published in years, not since he wrote his award-winning Great American Novel 7 years ago. This weekend proves even worse than he can imagine as he finds himself reeling from one misadventure to another in the company of a new Wonder Boy author who's played by Tobey Maguire. I always kind of saw Wonder Boys as being a kind of American version of Eight and a Half, which is a Fellini movie from the early 1960s about artistic block, about a writer's block, and what it is that causes that block. And both of them, if memory serves, are about a creative person who is reacting to his last great work and is unable to produce anything new. And his inability to produce anything new is ultimately revealing about something that's going on within him. And so it is I think it's I always like movies about the creative process. Eight and a Half is one of the greatest movies ever made, and again, one of my all-time favorite movies. But Wonder Boys is I don't want to say it's a retelling of that, because it's different in so many ways, and the movie is definitely not Fellini-esque. I do want to make that point in terms of its style, but it is a really well-made movie about an extremely interesting topic for me, with great performances from Michael Douglas and Tobey Maguire and Frances McDormand, who's also great in the movie. And I named I didn't. In fact, I shouldn't take credit for that. But my band was named after this movie from that time period. So that's Wonder Boys. Highly recommend Wonder Boys. And I'm not going to be talking about really anything post 2010, because it's hard to know really what will make great movie lists. Movies that came out in the last 10 years. I think I think some things might be easy to evaluate that way, but who knows? Like, some movies that I might say would never be on it might end up on a list in 10 years. So I'm not going to go beyond this last one, which I'll talk about, which is from 2007, I believe, which is the movie I'm Not There, which is a Bob Dylan biopic, and I have this one on DVD as well. Is it Blu-ray or DVD? It's probably DVD. This was before my Blu-ray period, before the Blue period, and this movie came out at a time when there were just so many biopics that were being released. There was most famously Ray and Walk the Line. And I'm Not There is a kind of a nice antidote to those movies, because those biopics, I know that there's certainly an audience for those biopics, but those biopics always bothered me, not only because they became so generic so quickly, but because it was so often an attempt to capture somebody's life in 2 hours. And there's no way you could ever really honestly do that. So you end up having to create a caricature of a person and say that that's who they were, and present their whole life in terms of moments that work to reinforce that caricature. And so those movies always frustrated me to watch, especially when they were made about people that I had a great deal of respect for, like Ray Charles and like Johnny Cash. And I love Bob Dylan as well. I've talked about him before on this podcast, but this movie does a very creative thing with the biopic, in that it tells the story of Bob Dylan with from what I can recall, 6 different actors playing a character. I don't think any of them, maybe one of them, is called Bob Dylan, but if memory serves, none of them are called Bob Dylan. But they're all just kind of, you could see Bob Dylan a little bit in these stories, but it works just based on what I have said before about Bob Dylan. If you go and look at my video on the Odyssey, Homer's Odyssey, naturally, as one does when talking about Homer's Odyssey, there's an extended conversation about Bob Dylan in that video, and I talk about how Bob Dylan is very purposefully hard to pin down. Right? He makes it. He has purposely created a persona that makes it impossible to truly define who he is. And he's, as I say, he does that purposely. He doesn't want to be categorized. He doesn't want to be placed in a box. In fact, his whole career is resisting being placed in a box and being categorized in a particular way. And so, to say that, again, a biopic that would do what I just said did with Ray Charles and Johnny Cash, where you reduce somebody to a caricature and reduce them to the moments in their life that reinforce that caricature, would be, I think, doubly offensive to somebody like Bob Dylan, who has outright gone out of his way to resist that sort of stereotyping throughout his career. And this movie very actively also resists that. To say that you're not just one person, you're a series of people, and part of who you are involves reality, but part of who you are also involves mythology. That's true of all of us to some degree, that we have a tendency of mythologizing our own life. We remember our life events in particular ways, in ways that kind of potentially serve us in the moment. So the movie's all about that. I think it's all about, this person who is multifaceted, who is both real, who is both myth, and yeah, it demonstrates that, I think, in the most creative way possible. The music is, of course, amazing, and the performances in it are fantastic. Again, as it says here, Christian Bale, Cate Blanchett, who is phenomenal in the movie. She, interestingly enough, the one variation of Bob Dylan that's most like Bob Dylan is the one that's played by Cate Blanchett. Christian Bale, Cate Blanchett, Marcus Carl Franklin, Richard Gere, Heath Ledger, and Ben Whishaw. Is obviously, I haven't spent too much time with Ben Whishaw, but all of them play Bob Dylan. And this, like The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner, those are the 2 movies on my list that would belong in my absolute top tier films. For a long time, I would say to people that this was the sort of last, in my opinion, the last great movie made, that has since been supplanted by other movies like, Roma and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and movies like that. But those are recent movies. I feel like in some ways they might end up making people's great movie lists. I don't know. But so I wouldn't include them in tonight's video, and for the reasons that I mentioned before. But for a long time, this was what I would have said was maybe the best contemporary film. Not contemporary anymore, though, because it's 2007. But yeah, those are my 10 picks. And I hope you found this entertaining, but I'm very eager to find out what your 10 movies would be. 10 movies that you think are really great, but wouldn't end up being in a great movie list, like the ones that I described. I'm excited to hear what your own particular choices might be. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. And we will I have to set up my, actually, hold on a second. Let me do this the right way. Hey, welcome back. We will see you in the next one. Take care. Have a great night. Oh, and by the way, if you are watching this, if you like the video, like the video, give me a like. Please feel free to subscribe. Uh, hit the bell for updates. If you're listening on the Apple Podcasts, please feel free to rate and review. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And yeah, hope to see you in the next one. Thanks. Take care. Bye bye.